Okay, we're looking at the Doctrine of Violence here. We finished chapter 2 in Esther, and 3 pages here for the Doctrine of Violence, and we will be right into chapter 3, verse 1. Again, looking at the last prominent figure introduced, the principal, one of the principal figures in the book of Esther is introduced in chapter 3, verse 1, but he is a guy that will epitomize violence. Unrighteous violence. So we will deal with him, Haman. So here we are on page 1 in the Doctrine of Violence. We looked at major point 2 about the middle of the page. What is the origin of sinful violence? This question, when you look at it, it's not within mankind. It's ultimately within Satan. And from this, B, at some point, Satan became internally filled with violence. So here we read it's a very important chapter or passage really in Ezekiel 28 dealing with Satan. This is a key passage when you're dealing with basically the career of Satan, how he's created perfect. He was in a privileged position, and in his own, internally, in his own angelic volition, he sinned. And it had nothing to do with being created perfect or God created me this way, so I had no other, that's the rationalization. God created me this way, so that's why I act this way. No. He created you perfect, and you made choices to do certain things. And so it is with human volition as well. C, that violent attitudes and behaviors prevalent in mankind are an after effect of Adam's fall. Now, Roman numeral 1, Adam acquired an old sin nature which he subsequently passed on to his descendants via procreation, thereby contaminating the entire human race. The only exception, Jesus Christ. Look at Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, this of course is referring to Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Of course, there's a number of doctrine of deaths, there's a number of different deaths, but here we have spiritual death, and this is spread. And because of this too, the original sin, we also have physical death as well. But the real big problem is spiritual death. And that is something that happened immediately after the fall. You had Adam and Eve, that they became spiritually dead. And so that's our big problem. When we're born physically alive, but spiritually dead. And so that is always a deficit that every member of the human race except Christ has to deal with. And we deal with that through Christ, believing in him. Those who don't never rectify that deficit. You will always be spiritually dead. And then perpetuated, they will then go to hell. Verses 16 through 17 here, verses 16 through 17 in Romans 5. And the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one transgression, resulting in condemnation. But on the other hand, the free gift arose from many transgressions, resulting in justification. For by the transgression of the one, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. So here in then 18, so then as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, referring to Adam's fall and then its effect on all of us, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. One act of righteousness refers to Christ going to the cross, bearing sins. Because of this, then, again, for those that believe, we are declared righteous or justified. It's a potential. That's the thing. All you have to do is believe. It's all been accomplished. Like I said, the table's been set. All you have to do is sit down and eat. And many people are, no. Can't be bothered with it. It's like, well, you will at some point find out. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And we looked at that too. That doesn't mean everyone's going to believe in Jesus Christ, but everyone will, even unbelievers will have to acknowledge who and what Jesus Christ is, period. There will be no denying, oh, this Jesus guy, no, he's not, he's this or he's that or whatever. No, he's going to actually be before your face. And of course, personally, he will be judging all of us. Believers too at the Bema, unbelievers at the great white throne judgment. But they will know. I mean, when you look at it, when you go to hell, we understand that you're going to be there until the great white throne judgment. And as Jesus Christ is reigning on planet Earth, you'll know. You'll have some idea of what's going on. You'll have details. You cannot, and we were talking about Satan, and kind of the interesting thing, one of the verses in Ezekiel 28 that we really didn't go into, but one of the last verses we read was that, to the effect he would be thrown down, he would be set before kings, lower than kings. And actually, when you look at, there's other verses dealing with him in hell, and he will occupy the lowest position in hell. Of course, this is, when you think about it, well, that's very appropriate. Satan, the greatest antagonist against God, period, will be the lowest one in hell, the ultimate place of judgment for those who don't believe. And people will look at him, and basically, he is the one that led us astray. And then, there will be scorn heaped upon him, but he will be the lowest of the low. That's his future, and you can see why, when you paint it in that light, why he does what he does, and he is relentless, and he is highly motivated, okay? And this will happen to him, and he knows this, so while he still has opportunity, he tries everything to thwart that ending, which, of course, is impossible, but Satan is Satan, and he doesn't stop with that. You think, why doesn't he just give up? The proverbial writing is on the wall. He doesn't stand a chance. Well, he doesn't. It's arrogance. Till the last little bit. Till he's actually sentenced. And we would say in the millennium, physically restrained for 1,000 years. Until you restrain him, he's going to keep on keeping on. And propagating evil and promoting his plan through various ways. And deceiving the world. Okay, so here, with Adam's fall, humanity acquired an old sin nature. It's passed on, doesn't skip a generation or anything like that. It is a perpetual thing. All humanity except Christ. 2, since the fall, every member of humanity has an old sin nature and therefore a predilection for evil. Ephesians 2:1. Even that cute squishy baby, and angelic little thing, only for a little. And then, we see the manifestation in various ways of an old sin nature, which is entirely consistent with the biblical, Bible doctrine regarding this. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you formerly walked, and the dead here, of course, is spiritual death, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. So, among them, we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. So we're spiritually dead. All humanity is born spiritually dead. And not only that, but when we act out and so forth, we indulge the desires of the flesh and of the mind, whatever we want to do. Now, this doesn't mean you're going to be a crazed maniac going out there and all these different things. You could be a completely law-abiding citizen and pay your taxes on time, all these different things, right? You're just upstanding in every way. You're spiritually dead, though, so in God's eyes, not that these other things are meaningless, but really, ultimately, you're not pleasing to God. But Even so, even if you are well-behaved and civic-minded, that kind of thing, you are still, by your very nature, a child of wrath, a child of Satan. And this has to do because what doesn't change, despite any overt behavior or anything like that, which is important, but what the most important thing that doesn't change is your spiritual condition, and that is it is dead. But you believe in Jesus Christ, all that changes. Of course, part of the exhortation, though, when you look at that as believers, is that you don't go back to, the lust of the flesh and so forth, and all these different things. So we have a predilection for evil. 3, Roman numeral 3, mankind wasted little time in indulging their predilection for violence. We've just seen this with Cain and Abel, and then also Genesis 6, where, Cain and Abel, this was, murder. Murder one, as we would say. Now, when we go to Genesis 6, we see that, the old sin nature now has flourished and is really corrupted, and so that you have this violence everywhere. 4, it is evident that sinful violence is a common old sin nature trait, part of the lust of the flesh here. And again, just look around you. It is very, very common. 5, to engage in sin, particularly violence, is to emulate the progenitor of violence, Satan. John 8:44 here. Here Christ condemning some Jews for their arrogance, thinking they had everything together since they thought they were children of Abraham and so forth. Well, in fact, they were children of Abraham in the sense physically, they could claim a certain descent. However, spiritually, the most important thing is that, Abraham was a believer, and he's the father of nations. So it is something, though, that they didn't believe. That's what they were missing. Many of the legalistic Jews here, they had this, this racial superiority, if you will, especially too, when they were looking at the Gentiles, the Romans. Oh, they hated Romans and stuff. But they held fast to these traditions and really took pride in them. But they didn't recognize the reality of it, the sacrifices, stuff like that, really what they taught. And they foreshadowed the Messiah, all these different things, down to, as we know, the Passover lamb, and which Christ, that typified the coming of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross. All these basic things that positive believers in the Old Testament during the age of Israel, they got this, they recognized this. The Jews of Jesus' day did not, and for the most part. And they instead based their confidence on their physical lineage, and background. And he's saying, and this is truly, truly offensive. You've seen people very proud of their heritage and stuff like that. I mean, that's pretty. Here's one of the things, coming to America, America being America, we're described as a melting pot, and that is true to a large extent. So what happens here, especially on the East Coast, where a lot of people come in, and even on the West Coast, you have a lot of people coming in, and then they get established, and then they move inward. Well, you have a lot of ethnic groups sticking together and very proud of, who they are, where they come from, all these different things. You have Italian-American organizations, you have German-American, you actually have, I think in the last year, you have a Turkish-American organization down here, and all these different things. And people are proud of their background. And here's the thing, when you look at this, the Jews were especially proud of theirs. And Christ, who being a Jew, he said, well, no, God is not your father, neither is Abraham. Actually, your father is Satan. This would be a slap in the face. And so imagine, and so he says this, and he didn't pull any punches. He said, you are of your father, the devil, in verse 44, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature because he's a liar and the father of lies. So that's their father. So, be proud of all that, whatever. But the reality from God's point of view is that, when you split people up, you're a believer or you're not. If you're a believer, you are a child of God. Thank you. If you're not, child of Satan. It's that cut and dry. There's no in between. And so, believers, that's the thing. You have to see that they emulate their father. They lie, cheat, steal, have murderous intent, acts of violence, and all different things. They're just doing what their father would do. 1 John 3:8. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. So, fuller study here, it is not a matter of anyone who commits sin, because we all commit sin. But unbelievers are consistently here practicing sin in the sense that, not that they are always committing evil acts and so forth. However, they are consistently ruled by their old sin nature. So in that sense, they always practice sin. It's not isolated. It's not set aside positionally, experientially. No, they don't have any of those dynamics because they haven't believed. So they practice sin. And with this, you see that it's part of, of what the devil, what Satan, what he does, as a matter of fact. And so we emulate, those who are his children emulate, not we're as believers, but unbelievers, emulate their father. Okay, page 2 here. Until Christ establishes his rule on earth during the millennium, sinful violence will be a prominent characteristic of our world. Isaiah 2:4. Verse 2, now come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. This is referring to Israel and specifically Jerusalem. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this right here, when you encounter this promise, has never occurred. The nations have not streamed to Israel. Matter of fact, if anything, it's the exact opposite. You have the world condemning Israel for basically, for various things. I mean, we get that. But there will be a time during the millennium when Christ is ruling here, where the nations will come to it and actually will be the preeminent nation. And there will be an actual desire to know God's truth. And that here we see in the middle of verse 3, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths, for the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. So, although there will be a rebellion at the very end, there's not going to be, worldwide conflicts like what we have. World War I, World War II, and when you look throughout history, there's been huge wars and periods of wars. In Europe, they have this period, the 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War. These are periods of history. That doesn't mean every single minute there is war going on, but there's a period of hostilities and animosity between nations and coalitions that, this is just something in our history that we're so used to. And so in our day, though, we also have worldwide conflict, nation against nation, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, genocides, all these different things. And this is not going to happen when Jesus Christ is ruling. But when you see this verse, this is actually quoted for convenience by many people that could care less about God, but they care about world peace. And so they'll quote this verse 4, this idea that they'll hammer the swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And this idea of nation will not rise against nation, and this ideal, right? But they divorce this, they take this verse, and we would say wrench it out of context, because who is going to accomplish this peace that these idealists, humanists love? Well, Christ is, Jesus Christ. It's not going to come about because, we're just tired of war and we're just, can't we all get along? Nope, that doesn't work. So, again, people quote the Bible when it's convenient and, when it suits their needs, but it's out of context here. The only way you're going to have peace, justice, and a lack of war is when Christ comes in and actually, when we talk about Armageddon, that's complete, total warfare, and Christ absolutely destroys all his enemies. That's only when you will have peace after that. It's not going to be like, there's an armistice, like what we have, South Korea, North Korea, there's a line you don't go across. We'll just kind of, be at odds with one another, and there's not any conflict, but it's tension. It's both sides are kind of checking one another, that type of thing. No, when Christ comes, there's not going to be an armistice. There's going to be absolute victory as he wipes out his enemies. Those who then oppose him, he will also wipe them out. There will be righteous rule, and there will not be toleration of violence that we have today. That'll be nice. So sinful violence will be a prominent characteristic of our world. Now 3, how does God relate to violence and violent persons? We have all this going on around us. So what gives? What is God going to do about it? What does he do about it on a daily basis? Well, A, God does not engage in sinful violence or unrighteousness of any type due to his perfect essence. This we know. Key here, sinful violence. B, however, God manifests righteous violence towards those who participate in evil. And this is seen as punitive action for sin. Psalm 106:29, turn there. They were just talking about, or referring to Genesis 6 and all the evil of mankind. Of course, one of the ultimate and punitive measures against mankind is the flood. That was due to sin. Your various indiscretions of the Jews, and in particular, the Exodus generation. 28, they joined themselves also to Baal Peor, a pagan deity here, and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. Thus they provoked him to anger with their deeds, and the plague broke out among them. Idol worship, discipline. It's like guaranteed, there's a formula. And in this case, thousands died with a plague. Punitive measures. So, it's violence in the sense that you have divine discipline. So punitive measures here. See, he is opposed to those who employ sinful violence. Psalm 5:6. Turn back. Chapter 5 here in Psalm. verse 4 here, you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor no evil dwells with you. You know, speaking to his perfect righteousness here. And then verse 6, you do destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the man of bloodshed and deceit. So this man of bloodshed, a man of violence, who gains by violence, whether it's murder or whatever, even threat of violence. You know, this is something that the Lord detests. Then 11:5. The Lord tests the righteous and the wicked, and the one who loves violence, his soul hates. So not good. So when we see, you know, as an example in our news, people who are violent, notably the cartels. I mean, you know, if you've not familiar with the type of violence perpetrated by these organizations, I mean, it's disgusting. It's vile. And they are exactly what, you know, these prophecies about violence in the last days, this is the prophecy here, they fulfill these to a T. I mean, it is absolutely brutal. And so God will deal with these individuals and organizations as well. But, geez, it's really bad. And he will punish them. So here again, actually, Psalm 11:5, the Lord tests the righteous and the wicked, and the one who loves violence, his soul hates. And then D, he will punish those who are violent. Psalm 7:16. Yes, 16 there. So here with the wicked who employs violence, they don't necessarily realize it, but this is what's going to happen. 16, his mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own pate. You know, live by the sword, die by the sword, that type of thing, where you have, you know, these cartels and other violent types, or gangs and stuff like that. There's we have this term today, right? Gun violence. It's just, you know, it's violence. And much of it is perpetrated with firearms, but that doesn't, you know, that's a whole nother thing. It could be knife. You don't see a lot of stabbings and around here on the island, some machetes with certain gangs and so forth. It's disgusting. And that's what you have, though. They will be punished. God is opposed to them, and that's just one of those things that if you are ever in God's crosshairs, then you know, it's not a good thing, but frequently they will just do themselves in by their own cycle of violence. Yet as in the case of Nineveh in the book of Jonah, he may graciously spare those who repent of violence. We won't turn there, but that's one of the great things in there. Pretty amazing, really, where you have the Assyrians, that they were a nation essentially built on violence. And this we see from Nahum, which involves the judgment of Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire. But in Jonah, we see another, which preceded the fall, obviously, but yet a repentance and the recognition that they were a very violent people by the king. But they fasted and everything, and they repented, at least a portion of them, enough so that God spared them. And you know, this is one of those things that if you're a violent type, you can give it up. That's the thing with old sin nature activity. You can stop if you want to. Those who are violent shorten their lifespan. Psalm 55:23. Go back to the gangs. A lot of young individuals there, and they die young. Young violent criminals die young and violently many times. But you, O God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. Yeah, it shortens your life. You know, if you want to have good quality of life and hope for length of life and quality of life, because that's a good combination, it's no use living a long time if you're miserable, right? Well, you know, a lot of people, they're not going to even see length of days because their quality of life is terrible. They're just violent. So they won't live out half their days in this case. God determines that, when to pull the plug and shorten them up. But, you know, again, it's not like an individual is not given opportunity. We're all given opportunities. God is a God of grace. Okay, so that's how God relates to violence and violent persons. They will be judged. He, of course, is not involved in any type of sinful violence, but he is involved with the violence on a level that's righteous in the sense it's divine discipline, which can include the destruction of nations, of course, the ebb and flow of history. But this is entirely different when it follows the course of God's righteousness. For the believer in violence, A, we are not to resort to sinful violence or any old sin nature activity to resolve various circumstances we encounter in the cosmos. Romans 12:1. I exhort you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual or rational service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So, not to be conformed to this world, which is so violent. 18 and 19. Verses 18 and 19 here. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, because it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So, that's how you are to react. If you encounter hostility, you're 20, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the good here, Bible doctrine. Make the application. And, you know, if you're tempted to get physical with someone, don't. Let God deal with it. Let him. He's the one that has to sort these things out. And some people run that way. I remember counseling a believer years ago that he couldn't go out and hit someone in the parking lot because they were angry. You'd think, well, of course not. No, maybe you don't have the old sin nature trait, but there's such a thing as seeing red. And if you don't rein that in, you will go out to the parking lot and hit someone. So that's when you have to step in and say, get in fellowship. And this is not, this is not appropriate. It's really not an option for the believer. This is not a case of defending yourself. This is a case of aggression. So this is not good. You can defend yourself, of course. If someone attacks you, there is that element as well. But you can't be aggressive and go beat someone down because they offended you. See, that's what Haman did. He was offended, and so what he tried was satanic. So, as a believer, you can't do that. Yeah, years ago too, not here. There's this. It's interesting how the old sin nature works too. That one individual, when I was getting ready to leave Oklahoma after seminary was complete and so forth, and I remember a conversation that, I thought that we would have been having fellowship and stuff like that, and it wasn't the case. We didn't develop a close friendship as I anticipated. One of the primary reasons, because there's drinking involved, not just any drinking, but the person would drink and then fight. and get disorderly like that. And that's a very, very bad combination. So I recognized that from the get-go, and kept my distance. And God has a way of, if you're praying about your fellowship and who you hang around with, God will provide for you and guide you and stuff like that. But anyway, this was an individual that I thought, I'd be close to, but it's not the case. And one of the comments they said too, and they thought this too, by the way, they thought we would get closer, but we didn't. And he said, and one of the comments, he goes, usually I hit my good friends. And no, I mean, it's like, well, I'm glad I'm not one of your good friends then, I mean, this is one of those things that he said, I always fight. He said, basically, I fight with my best friends. And it wasn't just a little verbal spat. He gets physical with his best friends. And I'm thinking, this is a, complete 100% old sin nature. But that's how it is with some people. A lot of people aren't that extreme, but there are some. You never know. So B, believers must avoid sinful violence on every level, mental, verbal, and physical. C, do not admire violent people. Rather, the adjusted believer must separate from violent individuals. I used to go to a barbershop, and right on the wall, well, you walk in there, and the guy that I used, you'd sit in the chair, and you turn to the wall, and they had this like movie poster of Tupac Shakur, who was a gangster who was gunned down. Okay, well-known thug and so forth. And then you start looking around, Sopranos and all these different, The Godfather. Now, it's nothing against Italian Americans or anything like that, but if you understand The Godfather, the Mafia, the Sopranos, Mafia, very violent. But these are individuals. I know some were just actors. Tupac wasn't, okay? But some of these, it's this idea that they admired these characters. And it wasn't just, well, this actor did a really good job. Who was in The Godfather? Al Pacino did a really good job or whatever. No, that's not it. But they admired this type of violence and, all of this. And that is not to be part of our life. I mean, if you find yourself, gee, I wish I could be like Tony Soprano, you have problems. This is not a good career choice for you. And, so you need to watch that. Not that I've heard that, but most people don't. But so do not admire violent people. Rather, the adjusted believer must separate from violent individuals. Proverbs 3:31 here. Do not envy a man of violence. Do not choose any of his ways. Don't follow him. And I find it interesting too, speaking of some of these movies, there's a movie out there, a series, and it's called Gomorrah, and it's an Italian film, Italian series. There's English subtitles and so forth. It's well acted, okay? And it's about the mafia in Naples. So the Neapolitan mafia, and some of the characters are, trying to get out of it, and the different things and so forth. But one of the things is that the producer, now my understanding is that he did such a good job depicting some of these people. He was receiving death threats saying, "You will not make any more series after this," and it had really offended some of the people. So it's even those people that are actually making movies about violent people, they get in trouble too. So, but part of it is an admiration and so forth. You're involved, and we don't know all the details on that, but I found it kind of interesting. Guess he had to go into hiding for a little bit too. So it wasn't just, please, a polite letter of, please stop that. No, well, he was told, no, or, we're going to come after you. So anyway, fun and games in the devil's world, I guess, huh? D, although violent types may prosper for a time under God's permissive will, ultimately he will judge them. And that is the thing. You might see people succeeding. Why does God allow this? Why? God is, it's his permissive will. We are in the devil's world, but at some point, God will act in his perfect timing. And again, it might not be on our timetable. You might be deeply offended and critical of God. We should not be. You can be offended in the sense of righteous anger towards other things, towards the evil around you to a certain point. Do not be critical of God, though. He will step in at the proper time. His timing is impeccable, unlike ours. And his understanding is complete. He's omnipotent. We are not. We might think we might know the best thing, but it's ultimately God calling the shots here. All right, this is where we're going to stop today. We'll pick this up on Wednesday. As a reminder, and I'll announce this again on Wednesday, we will not have class next Sunday, okay, which would be the 5th, and Wednesday and Thursday, the 8th, July 8th. We will have class Wednesday and Thursday this week, but next Sunday, no, and the following, then Wednesday, Thursday, no class. All right, until Wednesday, though, think about these things. We have political intrigue here in Esther, assassination, behind the scenes stuff going on. Esther's being real secretive. Mordecai's super secretive, yet he displays his loyalty towards the king. You're going to have what's coming up, Haman, and the violence he's going to perpetrate or try to. The violence that actually will occur, because the order to kill all the Jews wasn't rescinded. Couldn't be, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. But another law was added, basically, or a provision was given, the Jews could defend themselves. So they took full opportunity of that and were victorious. You have a holiday with this, but there will be violence, and there will be righteous violence at the end too. So this is something too, it's like, well, violence is violence. No, it's not. And there is such a thing as self-defense or self-preservation, that type of thing. Of course, we'll look at it too. When you look at capital punishment, like what we've just seen in our context with those eunuchs who were plotting assassination, capital punishment, well, where should the believer stand on that? Well, the Bible is most definitely for capital punishment in certain things. So we will look at that, though, when we finish out here the doctrine of violence. And that's one of the things, too, many believers have fallen apart on. And it is something that actually, not only does God, prescribe capital punishment, but in Israel's case, too, if you don't execute murderers, then this was basically, Israel would be judged for that. The blood would be on the land, so to speak. And then enough blood on the land, God would act and demand justice. So if someone's taking another human life like that, in murder and so forth, and we'll say premeditated murder, then they forfeit their life. And so there were provisions for that, and not to do that would be a big problem. Well, then you look at that concept, Bible doctrine there, and you look at what we do, which is sometimes we do, depending on the state. Sometimes we execute them after, 20 years on death row, something like that, after they have a law degree and all these different things. It's ridiculous. But this is what we have. But justice is slow to coming. And again, it's something that if we get justice, it's slow sometimes. That is why you just have to count on the Lord and deal with that. Otherwise, there's a big letdown and people become disillusioned. People that become disillusioned, then what do sometimes? Well, there's a lot of civil unrest when people become disillusioned and angry and violent. All these things we see all around us. And it's old sin nature. It really is. So we have to look at this from the biblical perspective and continue to pray, for your own personal protection too, as a practical matter, because we do live in violent, perilous times. But God knows this, but we are to pray to him that he will protect us and allow us to continue to go to spiritual maturity. Again, as I mentioned, 33 years Faith Bible Church has been in existence. So, I'd like to keep it going until the rapture, and I pray that that would be soon. But we stand for Bible doctrine. We do not stand for watered down devotionals that will not get you through the hard tests of life that, it even said, we read a verse, God's going to test us. And we better have the doctrine to, go through it. And it might be bumpy, but, the truth, that is the thing. God will give you the truth. He'll give you the resources. And we just have to keep the momentum going. And so we should. That's it. That's the command to do so. And keep fearing him. And as we looked at the verse right before class, keep fearing him and keeping his commandments. That's basic stuff. But that is the fundamental, that's the underpinning of our Christian way of life and how we keep our momentum going to spiritual maturity and hopefully the wreath. So anyway, we'll pick this up on Wednesday. Father, thank you for this opportunity and privilege here. We can study the book of Esther and the doctrine of violence. I pray that we look at these principles and apply them to our lives and glorify you in these last days. In Christ's name I pray, amen.